Well, hello out there. I'm T.M. Brown, and welcome to the next reading from my very first book, A Life Not My Own. I'm so excited that you guys continue to join me on this journey, and my intent is to share more with you than you'd experience if you read my story on your own. So you may decide that you want to read along with me, and you can grab yourself a copy of A Life Not My Own from www.authortmbrown.com. We started with the very first page, and we're going to work our way through the entire book. The page that we're starting this particular episode on is page 35. Are you ready? Other than the visits we made to Virginia, Fort Smallwood, and Mayo, Maryland, the socializing that Ma and Frank participated in took place at or near our home in Baltimore. It seemed that we had all we needed right there at our house. The people who visited us always returned. The neighborhood children liked to hang out with my grandfather as well. He would take as many of them as our car would hold when we went crabbing. This was the common pastime of residents in my community when I was a child. Our community was only a few miles away from streams that were part of the Chesapeake Bay. We'd arise early in the morning and make our way to go crabbing, packing a lunch along with the items required to crab. Crabbing was a relatively inexpensive sport. All that's really needed is a heavy-duty string, raw chicken parts, a net, and a bucket. Ma, Sharon, and I would sit and watch Frank, Mac, and the other boys from the neighborhood crab for hours. Frank was an excellent crabber. He'd find 2 sticks that were about 6 feet or longer and hammer them into shoulder-deep water, placing them about 5 feet apart. He'd tie a piece of string from one pole to the other. Then he'd tie the raw chicken, and Frank preferred to use chicken wings, to another piece of string. The strings attached to the chicken would then be tied to the string attached to the pole. It was just a matter of waiting for the crabs to nibble on the chicken and then scoop them up out of the water with a net. We'd have enough crabs to feed our whole block when we returned. Although Frank liked to crab, he never ate crabs. I loved them and still do. Once I learned how to crack the shells and clean the inner portions out. I could sit for hours and eat them. Betty visited the house often now. She'd usually visit on Fridays and sometimes stay overnight. I remember she and my aunt getting really dressed up and going to a cabaret. There was a lot of preparation that went into looking their best. They both were so happy when they left for the evening. When they returned, my aunt had a huge cut on the left side of her face. It was at least 6 inches long, extending from her jawbone to the top of her ear. The events that led to the cut were not spoken of, at least not in the presence of us kids, but I don't remember Betty and my aunt ever going out again. Betty continued to visit, though. I remember one visit in detail. There was someone banging on the front door. I looked out the peephole of the door, and it was Betty, yelling, "I've been violated! That son of a bitch! That son of a..." "Tina, who is that at the door?" Mama said. "Mama, I've been violated," she cried. "He violated me," she said, crying and whining. She had that look on her face. It was the same look I remember seeing when we lived with her. "Call the police. He violated me." She was standing outside the front door screaming, and the neighbors were beginning to peek out their doors. "Come on in here, girl," Ma said. Ma called the police, and as usual, it took hours before they arrived. It was 1971, and police weren't in a big hurry to come rescue us in our neighborhood at that point. The police had little regard for crimes committed in our neighborhood. The only ones that seemed to concern them were those committed against whites. Otherwise, it was common to wait hours for the police to arrive for any type of black-on-black crime. There are probably those of you reading this who may say this is just one person's opinion. If you grew up in my neighborhood, you'd know better. There were incidents where blacks were beaten beyond recognition for petty crimes such as walking down the street with a bottle of beer, not answering a policeman's questions fast enough, or even loitering. When the police finally arrived, they asked Betty questions about the incident, filed a report, and we never heard from them again. I was in the 6th grade when the incident happened. I had no idea what the term violated meant. No one in the family seemed willing to tell me. Ma told me I was too young to be concerned with grown folk stuff and not to discuss it in school. One of my male classmates explained it all to me in detail, more detail than I ever wanted to know. My 6th grade male classmates were eager to explain whatever adult topics needed clarification. The boys in my class assigned themselves the task of identifying those girls in class who were ready for bras, and the few well-endowed girls would strategically place themselves in the girls' bathroom to confirm the assessment. Ma, I think I need a bra, I said. Why? Ma said, most of the girls in my class are already wearing one, and some don't have as much as me. I wasn't about to tell her that the girls had cornered me in the bathroom and asked me to show them my little buds. Okay, the next time we go to the store, we'll get you one, Ma said. Thanks. I can't believe it was that easy. Usually Ma asks more questions when I post something new. I would learn later that womanhood was just another area that neither Ma nor I were very comfortable discussing. At the very next Saturday, Ma and I went to the store and bought my first bra. It was tiny, and I do mean little. Blue satin bra. I wore it to school the following Monday and was happy to be cornered in the bathroom again in order to show off my new bra. So now we'll go on to the next chapter, Sir Death. It was a day just like any other day. You know, that's the crappy thing about death. It doesn't usually come to my door in an expected form. For example, a sick relative departing. No, it's been much more sneakier in most of its dealings with me. Well, anyway, I was sitting in the living room doing my homework before dinner, just like any other day, when the telephone rang. What? What did you say? No, you don't know. You don't know what you're talking about. No, she ain't. Who is this? Hello? Hello? And then there was crying. Mama crying. Oh no, oh no, oh no. I had never seen Ma cry before. She was always so strong. Even when something bad happened, she would always say things like, I told them, if they keep going like they going. But this was different. Shortly thereafter, a policeman knocked on our door and confirmed what the mystery caller had said. Betty was dead. My heart was filled with guilt, but also relief. Guilt about telling her, not more than 2 months previous, that I did not want to live with her, and relief that she wouldn't be hurting herself doing those drugs anymore. The dream that I had came to mind as well. I was sure that somehow the two were connected. Betty's death would be the beginning of a test for me. I knew that. I realized that I would not have a mother anymore. Although Ma was raising us, she never tried to take the title of our mother, and she never, ever said anything bad about Betty. I was in shock. Although I knew that she used drugs, had tried to kick the addiction in a number of recovery programs, I never thought that she could die. We had speakers visit our school and tell us all about the different kinds of drugs, but no one ever said, in the exact words, that drugs will kill you. Death taught me that. Something strange happened when my mother died. I couldn't find God anymore. My family wasn't very religious, but as kids, we attended church most Sundays. The church that we attended was part of a Catholic outreach program. The church had taught us to love one another and that we were all equal under the eyes of God. I believe that this is true, but as a teenager, I found it difficult to understand how Betty's death was overlooked by those that I attended services with every Sunday. Not one member of the church paid their respects to my family. I really needed their support. I felt lost and alienated. Eventually, I stopped attending church and felt my closeness with God slip away. Death is difficult to accept for most of us. No one is truly prepared to accept the death, no matter what the circumstances. To be the object of pity and sympathy was more than I could bear. The secret was out. Everyone in the community knew why Betty had died. My aunt traveled to New York to transport Betty's body back to Baltimore for burial. Ma was receiving money from social services to assist her and Frank in caring for Max, Sharon, and I. She used the money for the funeral and seemed to find comfort in telling friends and family that we kids had buried our mother. I sat in the shadows and watched my grandmother spend a ridiculous amount of money on Betty's funeral. She bought a beautiful pink casket lined in satin with brass handles, a beautiful evening gown to bury Betty in, paid the funeral costs, not to mention the money she spent on clothing for Mac, Sharon, and I. It was entirely overdone, in my opinion. Emotions really run high during the death of a loved one. I didn't know how to express my feelings about the amount of money that was being spent. And honestly, I don't think it would have mattered not one bit anyway. It wasn't my money, and it was Mama's daughter. I was only 13 when Betty died. Sitting on the front row at the funeral home and looking at my mother in her casket seemed unreal to me. Emotionally, I felt removed, detached from what was happening. She looked as beautiful as she did when I watched her put on her makeup when me and Mac lived with her. I kept thinking that it was all a dream and that she would just wake up. As the preacher spoke at the service, I remember thinking to myself how totally erroneous his comments were. Here lies our dear sister Betty Lou King. She was a loving mother, sister, and daughter. And in my mind, I'm thinking, she was a drug addict who left us a long time ago. I hope that you will be happy now that you don't have to use drugs anymore. This is what I said to myself. As I stood to view Betty's body for the last time, I felt the finality of the moment. I wanted so much to touch her face, to kiss her and say goodbye, but I just couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear at the thought of actually touching her lifeless body. The best I could do was to touch one of her arms that were folded across her waist. Betty was buried in a cemetery no more than 10 miles from our house. I had never been in a cemetery prior to her burial. To me, it seemed disrespectful to see people walking over the graves, taking shortcuts to Betty's final resting place. More comments were made about Betty as her body was lowered into the ground. It is one of the saddest memories of my life. In the years that followed, we visited Betty's grave on Memorial Day. It seemed more of a requirement than a need. As the years passed, the cemetery grew in need of major repair. The staff consisted of less than 5 people. At the suggestion of the funeral director, our family did not buy a tombstone. He thought it would be best to wait until the grounds settled before making the purchase. The grounds were in such disrepair that on one of our visits, we were unable to locate Betty's grave. We went to the administrative office there on site to find out where she was buried. They were very unorganized and referenced a location that I don't believe any of us felt was accurate. Slowly, the visits to the cemetery became further and further apart until eventually we stopped making visits altogether. A tombstone was never placed on my mother's grave. After the death of my mother, the realism of life started to take hold of me. Up until then, the latter half of my life had been pretty good. Now it was time for life's lessons to begin, I guess. I thought that the death of my mother